You want to take a ride? You're listening to Dark Matter Radio with your host, Ronnie McLean. Where we come to find that we're living with no boundaries, all things are possible, and that we are in an infinite universe. Every day we manifest what we have been programmed to believe, what we concentrate on the most, and that is the condition in this society. We must continue the reestablishment of our communities and the self-relationships we have within, and that is just the start. And again, as I say, welcome to Dark Matter Radio. This is your host, Ronnie McLean, and today we're going to be talking about the Doctrine of Discovery, something that many of us do not talk about at all. It's not even really being mentioned as a part of the process of any sort of decolonization, reparations, or anything else like that. And it is part of my four-step process of dealing with the whole entire subjugation of a people. Now, if you are from any of the islands, you're going to be very, very important for you to hear this. If you're Jamaican, Haitian, even Cuban, right? If you're part of the Bahamas, Tortola, Aruba, any of the islands that are down there, the Doctrine of Discovery is going to be a very, very, very important subject to you. The aboriginals over there in Australia, you better be listening to this as well, because this is going to be highly effective in understanding why certain things are taking place. Everyone on that continent of what I call Ethiopia, the first Ethiopia, is going to be very important, so-called Africa. Every single one of those countries over there, whether they were involved in the slave trade or not, is going to be heavily impacted by this conversation as well. In fact, anywhere on this earth where you would consider there to be indigenous people, aboriginal people, and even natives that have migrated thousands of years ago, and I would say more than the 6,000 year period mark, will be impacted by this as well, right? So aboriginal, indigenous, native people all around this earth will be impacted by this conversation that we're going to be having today. So please subscribe, share, important to share to your neighbors and everyone else, because it is very important for us to understand about this Doctrine of Discovery that was originated by the PayPal. So what is the Doctrine of Discovery? Let's get into that. The Doctrine of Discovery was originated in 1452. It specified invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all saccharins and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply appropriate to himself, to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. That is a quote from Pope Nicholas V, Papal Bull of 1452. That is extremely important for us to understand why the Doctrine of Discovery is so important for us all who are anywhere on the earth, even Europeans, to have an understanding as to why certain things are still going on to this very day. So, the Doctrine of Discovery is a philosophical legal framework dating back to the 15th century that gave Christian governments moral and legal rights to invade, seize indigenous lands, and to dominate indigenous peoples. The patterns of opposition and oppression that continue to depossess indigenous and aboriginals and native peoples of their very land to this very day are found in numerous historical documents, such as the papal bulls, royal charters, and the U.S. Supreme Court rulings as early or as recent as 2005, believe it or not. It is still in effect to this day. These and other concepts from the Pilgrims of Dominion that legitimates and extracts industries that displace and destroy many indigenous, aboriginal, native peoples of their valued communities, as well as harm the earth. The Doctrine of Discovery is seen as a power and principalities based on the following ideals that grew out of the criticism, right? Out of the Christian religion, out of this whole entire global thing that they were putting in effect at this particular time. And it gets into theologies of entitlement, justification of violence, and telos nullius, empty land. So telos nullius is the theological and legal document that discovered lands were devoid of humans. In other words, what they're saying is that aboriginal, indigenous, native beings or people were not considered human. If the origins or the original people who lived there, now the original people are either aboriginal or indigenous. Doesn't really include natives, because natives are people who are migrants or immigrants who come from someplace else. So they're talking about the original people that lived there, defined as heathens, pagans, and infidels, were not ruled by a Christian prince, right? And the justification of violence, the Christian empowerment European governments to use coercion, violence, including genocide and enslavement. The theologies of entitlement legitimize their conquest of both people and the land. So it's very important for us to understand that these things are still being applied today. We're going to go in just a second over a little bit of a timeline of this document, this discovery of document. So it is important for us to understand also the theology of entitlement. There are three main scriptural textures that undergird the doctrine of discovery. The Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded in you. That was in Matthew 28:19-10. And then also the divine mandate to submit to government rule. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. That's in Romans 13:1. And the third one, and the narrative of a conventional people justified in taking possession of the land, as described in Exodus story, manifest destiny in the U.S. grew out of this out of this letter, right? So there you have it. You got, what you call enslavement and extraction of the people of the land. So when we're looking at this Doctrine of Discovery, and we're looking at the timeline of it, it's extremely important for us to know that the Doctrine of Discovery started in 1492, even a little before them, because they wrote the Bible back, I believe it was 360 AD when it was basically completed. But it was put into effect in 1492 and lasted throughout the 1600s. And that was the era, what they call the era of Doctrine of Discovery. And that went all the way through the 1600s, overlapping the treaty-making era, right? And then from the treaty-making era, which started in about the somewhere in the later parts of the 1600s to 1871, you had the Indian Removal Act, and then you also had the Reservation era, and the Indian Removal era was between 1830 and 1850. The Reservation era was between 1850 and 1880. And then when you went into that, you had the allotment, assimilation, and that was kind of crazy too, because that's when all the DOS rolls and all that other type stuff started taking place. And that actually started in 1887, and that went into the Indian Reorganization era. And the Indian Reorganization era lasted from the 1930s to 1945. That began the process of Native Americans having the right to self-rule, because the Americans' allotment and reservation era wasn't going so well. So then you had the termination of that era, which started in 1945, which we're talking about, went into the 1961. Now, this is important, because throughout the 1960s, that's when you had the Civil Rights era, right? And that's when they reinstituted the Indian self-determination policy era, right? And that went into the 70s and beyond. And that was with the 1964 and all of its amendment all the way up through 1968 Civil Rights Act, right? Which began to start allowing you to know exactly who they considered to be American Indians and Native Americans, and how all of that was being doled out, right? So what you would call now today the blacks, African Americans, were actually entitled with the American Indians, as the Civil Rights Act was written specifically for them, right? So when you start talking about a lot of this stuff, you start talking about how the Doctrine of Discovery is still active in our lands and what's really going on with that today. And that's a serious situation. Very serious situation. So let us get into the actual Doctrine of Discovery, what it means, what it is, and what the concepts of it is. Now, many didn't understand that this was what they considered to be international law. So the Doctrine of Discovery is a concept of public international law. What does that mean? Public international law. International law, also known as public international law or law of nation, right, is a set of rules, norms, and standards generally regarded and accepted in relations between nations, and establish normative guidelines and a common contextual framework for states and nations to follow across a broad range of concepts, right? So this law expounded on the United States Supreme Court in a series of decisions, most notably Johnson versus McIntosh, right? And that in 1823 is a landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court that held private citizens could not purchase land from the Native Americans, as facts were recited by Chief John Justice Marshall at the time, the successor in interest to a private purchase from an Indian tribe to a citizen of the United States. So they used the basis of that, the doctrine of discovery, that was resulted in, or put in process in 1494, 1492, 1494, right? It explained and implied the way that colonial powers, and again, we have to get down to the definition of colonial powers. Colonialism is a policy of a nation seeking to extend and retain its authority over people's territories, generally within the aim of opening trade opportunities, colonizing countries seeking benefits from the colonized country or landmass, in the process of colonizing imprisonment or impose of their religion, economy, government, and ideals on the people of that land, right? So they laid claim to lands belonging to foreign sovereign nations during the Age of Discovery. What is the Age of Discovery? The Age of Discovery is an informal and loosely defined term from the period of European history in which extensive overseas exploration emerged as a powerful factor in European culture, and which was the beginning of European Christian globalization, right? So under it, the title lands lay within the government whose subjects travel and to occupied territories whose inhabitants were not subject of European Christian monarch. The doctrine has been preliminarily used to support decisions invading and or ignoring aboriginal, and in this case we're saying aboriginal is the ethnic groups who are original settlers, so aboriginal indigenous people, original settlers of a given region, contrast of groups that have settled, occupied, or colonized the area recently, more recently. The groups usually described as indigenous or aboriginal. So in this, when we talk about aboriginals, we're talking about people who were the first people of the earth. And when we talk about indigenous, we're talking about the first people of earth who were indigenous and inhabited that land, right? And then when we talk about natives, we're talking about natives, those who had migrated from one area to another area and settled there for a long period of time, right? Having births, becoming natives to that land, right? So natives are foreigners on an aboriginal landmass. Basically, that's what that is, right? So when you take a look at that, you're beginning to start getting a very, very clear picture that the inhabitants were not subjects of the European Christian monarch, which meant very bad news from those people. So the doctrine has a preliminary used to support decisions of invading and ignoring aboriginal, indigenous, and native possessions of land in favor of colonial or post-colonial governments. Now, post-colonial government would be something like the United States government, right? The 1823 case was a result of collusive lawsuits, right, where land speculators worked together and to make claims to achieve the desired result. John Marshall explained the court's reasoning, and the decision had been a subject of a number of law reviews, articles, and has come under increased scrutiny in modern legal theorists, right? I mean, people know that it's wrong today, and they don't really like exactly what is going on. So, you know, when you talk about this doctrine of discovery, right, the doctrine of discovery was promulgated by the European monarchs in order to legitimize the colonization of lands outside of Europe between the mid-15th century, 14th century, and the mid-20th century, 1800s, 1900s. This allowed European entitled to seize land inhabited by aboriginal indigenous people and even to take over native people's properties under the guise of discovery. The 1494 Treaty of Totalis declared that only non-Christian lands could be colonized under the Discovery Doctrine, right? So that is very, very important. So, you know, when you talk about that, even in the Treaty of Totalis, right, which was signed by Spain in June 7th, 1494, to authenticate the Civil-Portugal divide, the newly discovered lands outside Europe between Portuguese Empire and the Crown of Castle among the Mediterranean, 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. In other words, when you begin to start looking at the map, you take a look at this map that we have here, and you begin to start seeing, you know, what's really going on and how it's all being deciphered, right? And this map begins to start telling you that. So when you start looking at this map, right? You take a look at the map, and what we find in this map is the actual lines that they drew up before 1492. And this was in preparation for them receiving the 30-year-long war, which preceded that 60-year-long war that they had in Europe, to rid them and ethnic cleanse the continent of all carbon-based beings, melanated beings, dark-skinned people, as what you would call them, of the Hebrews and of the Moors, right? So what you see here, right, is the Treaty of Totalis, and the Treaty of Totalis was after the Portuguese jurisdictions was done, and the Treaty of Sarasota, right? Saragoras, right? So what the church did is that they divided it along the lines. First, they divided Africa and gave all of Africa and all of the other areas of the world, including Asia, to the Portuguese for their subjugation. Right? So that's what the Doctrine of Discovery did first. It gave it all to Portugal. Right? Spain wanted to be a part of that, and that's where Christopher Columbus came in. And Christopher Columbus said, well, there's lands to the west. That was what we now call the Americas, lands to the west. I can go to the lands of the west, and I can claim those from the Doctrine of Discovery for you and get you into the game of the Doctrine of Discovery. This is the reason why when he came back, what they did, it had the Treaty of Tordesillas, giving Spain the right to own and control all of the lands south of the islands, right, of the Caribbean islands, right, and that went into South America. So the Treaty of Sarasota, what happened is that around the islands of right there above Australia, those Polynesian islands, they were in dispute. So the PayPal government got them to be able to sign an agreement that they would divide up the areas of the of that area, right? So that's what that was all about. So you're looking at the exact map that was stripped out, so then that way you'll have all of the European nations, or Spain and Portugal, and what they were responsible for. Crazy, believe it or not. Crazy, but that is what it is. So it was the PayPal. And what they also did, let me share. So let me just back up just for a little bit here. And I want to get into the Treaty of what they call Sozoga, or the Treaty of Saragossa, right? It also referred to the capitalization of Zaragoza, was a peace treaty between Spain, Spanish Crown, and Portugal, signed on 22nd of April, 1529 by King John III and the Emperor Charles V, and the Agagosi city, or in the Agagosi city of Zaragoza. The treaty defined the areas of Sicilian, Spanish for Portuguese influence in Asia in order to resolve the Muckless issue, right, which has arisen because of the kingdom's claim in the Muckless Islands. And the Muckless Islands, as I was telling you, is the islands right up above New Guinea, right up above next to Australia, and it is of the Polynesian Islands, in the Vena Sea, right? And the Muckless Sea, right? Timber, Afa Sea, the Pacific Ocean over there, right? So it's right over there in between all those areas. And that's very, very important for us to understand, because the islands were known as Spice Islands due to nutmeg, mints, and cloves that were originally exclusively found there in the presence that sparked colonial interest from European in the 16th century. So the Doctrine of Discovery went all over, everywhere. It went everywhere, right? And the papal bull in the Inter issued by the Alexander IV on May 4th, 1493, played a central role in the Spanish conquest of the New World. Right? So, in this next part, I want to get into the actual document of what is the Doctrine of Discovery that was placed out there in 1493 for everyone to follow. So please listen to the next one, part 2 of the Doctrine of Discovery, and what it's all about and how it's influencing, because this cannot be taken care of. Unless this is taken care of, it will not be able to, no matter what decolonization process you're going through now or have gone through, your land still isn't your own, because the war on all these places through the Doctrine of Discovery is still in place by the PayPal and by the international law of the law of the lands within the nations of Europe. They still own you because of the Doctrine of Discovery. They still own the land, right? So even if you get decolonized, it doesn't matter, because they still own the land. They have a right to do whatever they want to do. So until the Doctrine of Discovery is actually off the books and not recognized anymore internationally, then we can begin to start talking about a whole lot of things. So the next part of this is the actual Doctrine of Discovery and what it is, and how it began to affect, and the 10 principles that followed what they actually had to do in terms of implementing this document of Doctrine of Discovery. That's it. Yeah, you can stop it now.